So we are going to go ahead and get started. Just again, want to welcome everyone. My name is Brandon Diet, Senior Manager of Sports Performance, Culture, and Marketing here at USA Fencing. Just to throw out a reminder again, if you wouldn't mind hitting the mute button for me on your computers or cell phones, tablets, whatever you may be on. Um, Again, I just want to welcome everyone to this last week of our Engaging Our Community series. We've had 5 incredible speakers so far, and I'm really excited to introduce you all to our 6th and final one. Today's session is going to be about allyship and leading with collective work in mind. We will be led by Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler, Chief Catalyst and founder of the Equity Project. The Equity Project is an organization designed to support organizations and communities in building diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Dr. Mosby Tyler herself is the former Senior Vice President and Chief Inclusion Officer for the Children's Hospital in Colorado. She was the first African American woman to hold this position in the organization's 100-plus year history. She's also the former executive director of the Office of Human Resources for the City and County of Denver, Colorado, the first African American woman to hold this position in the history and hold that position, in the 63-plus year history of that agency. Dr. Mosby Tyler is a consultant accredited by the Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence and recipient of the Cornell University Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Certification. She's nationally recognized for her equity work with nonprofit, community, government, and corporate organizations. Dr. Mosby Tyler holds a doctorate in the field of organizational leadership from the University of Colorado, a master's degree in management from Webster University, and a Bachelor of Science degree in education from the University of Alabama. So I would like to formally introduce you to Dr. Mosby Tyler.
Brandon, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you and the team. It's a great honor to be with you today and a privilege. Thank you so much. And wow, what an important time in history for this topic of allyship. You know, I feel really great about rounding out your professional education journey that you've had. I'm number 6, I just heard from Brandon. I'm hoping that our time together this afternoon just ties the bow on things that you may have already talked about or things that you were curious about. And I'm going to try to get through the conversation in enough time that I just leave space for you to ask any questions that you might have, even weaving in the journey that you had before I got here. There might be some relevant kinds of questions for you to be asking. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and we will get going. As I'm doing that, I also want to do an acknowledgement with you. And that acknowledgement, I'd be remiss if I didn't do it, is really to check in on you, to acknowledge that I know how tough of a time we're living in. I call it the convergence of 2 pandemics. The pandemic of COVID-19 meets the pandemic of racial reckoning. It's a global issue. But in the United States in particular, we're centered there. And so I want to acknowledge in my check-in to you that I recognize that each one of you in very different ways are trying to navigate this convergence of 2 pandemics. Each one of us is feeling differently about that experience. Each one of us is impacted in this experience very differently. And so as we think about allyship and all of the things that it will take for us to work in a collective, one of the things that I want you to think about is this moment and what this moment means to each of us and what it means to us differently. So I love to start with this slide. It's my favorite slide. It reminds me of something my parents used to teach me. They always said, we're all in the same boat. And I think every time they said that, I probably rolled my eyes. I wasn't sure about that. until I saw this image. And this image is an interesting one. I call it a consciousness slide. And what I want you to do is just keep it in the back of your mind as your consciousness. You know, one thing about the convergence of these two pandemics is it really in many ways has put us in the same boat. We are sharing some experiences in a very visible way. But the point of this slide really is to get you thinking broadly in your allyship. I want you to be thinking about where you are sitting most often in the boat when you're making decisions, forming opinions, or making judgments. Where are you sitting in the boat? And I want you to expand your vantage point about what's actually happening in the boat that you're really familiar with. What's happening in the whole boat? And so the realization here is if your worldview is only from the vantage point of where you sit, you have a wonderful and a great opportunity to be an ally differently in broadening your viewpoint there. So it's always a good reminder to me to always expand how I'm thinking about what I'm looking at, what I'm planning for, and what I'm making a judgment about. I wanted to share this slide with you. Wow, it's an old picture. It's me, circa 1969. But I thought it was the best photograph to make my point. And here's the point. I want you to know that sometimes things are not going to turn out exactly like you anticipated when you're thinking of being an ally. Every now and then, you will feel like what you just did was absolutely wonderful, like me in that picture. And then right next to you, in the same uniform, because that's your teammate, is someone that thinks that what you just did wasn't that wonderful at all. And then in the background, there's the person that's supposed to be in charge of it all. That's my dad, who doesn't think that what you did was important enough to even pay attention to. You'll think you're great. Someone will think you weren't great. Someone is not paying attention to you at all. Sometimes this is the triangle that we're in allyship. And I want you to know that it exists. You will be well-meaning and think that what you're doing in your allyship is spot on. Your colleague is going to think it wasn't spot on at all. And then the person that's in charge of it all isn't even paying attention. That will happen in this process. And we're going to talk about what we need to do about this triangle that will crop up in the process of you being an ally. So I thought I would talk about a few things that are speed bumps that can get in the way of our being allies or doing collective work even. And the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is something that's happening a lot right now. It's called the recency effect. And the recency effect is this phenomenon that happens where we tend to remember the things that get presented to us most recently, but we don't really remember things that got presented to us earlier. So in many ways, it's like living in an episode or a snapshot. You know, I have 3 adult young children, and they hate when I call them children. They're 3 young adults, and they have something that they're living in right now that really is about recency. They're in a news cycle, and so every day there's a new thing. So I always tell them to be sure to pay it forward, but play it backwards. Pay it forward, play it backwards. And my rationale there is recency effect doesn't give us an opportunity to tie what's happening right now to things that already happened. So we don't have the complete story when we live in the recency effect. So opportunity here for all of us is to make sure that you're not just living in, making decisions on, creating judgments around only the things that are in front of you right now. Without tying them to things that already happened, we're ill-equipped to then advance the things that we need to advance for the future. So always tying to the past is important. There's not much that's going on today, even in a time where we're in a lot of social unrest, that isn't in fact tied to something that already happened. So the recency effect is an important thing to keep considering. The other thing I want you to be thinking about, and I'm going to ask you to be selfish here. This is the one time I'm going to say be a little selfish. I want you to know that there's a lot of compassion fatigue that's going on right now. So what's compassion fatigue? One thing I'm going to tell you about compassion fatigue is it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care who you are, doesn't care what color you are, doesn't care what the objective is in the work that you do. We all get it. Compassion fatigue is a weariness, a real weariness that happens when we've been overexposed to things that we really need to care about. There are lots of different organizations and sectors and systems that are on the front lines of things where they have to keep caring. But even roles like yours involve a lot of compassion. And when you're overexposed to that, we're now asking you to layer what you are supposed to do in your work with, I need you to care about equity. I need you to care about this racial reckoning. I need you to care about the health concerns of COVID-19. All of those things create an overexposure to having to care about so many things that it can, in fact, shut us down. So when I think about one more thing that can sometimes get in the way of us being an effective ally, it is compassion fatigue. So I want you to be thinking about how that's impacting you. One more thing that happens. I see a lot of imposter syndrome. It shows up in all of us. It works a lot like the recency effect works, and it works a lot like all of the other things I'm going to be talking to you about. It doesn't discriminate either. I want you to know that imposter syndrome plagues us when we are in crisis. And we are in a social crisis right now, so you'll see a lot more of imposter syndrome. So what is imposter syndrome? In a nutshell, it is chronic self-doubt. It's not grounded in anything factual, but it is you believing, because there's this little whisper in your ear, that you're not good enough, you're not credible enough, you're not the right one to be talking about this, any of the above. It is you truly believing that you are an intellectual fraud. This chronic imposter syndrome is one of the culprits that gets in the way of us being allies. The minute that self-doubt starts and you begin to question whether or not you have what it takes to be an ally, to speak on something, to speak up about something, again, just like compassion fatigue, it can shut us down. Imposter syndrome can look like this. It can look like what you know looking really small as compared to what you think other people know. That's the assumption that you're making. When the reality is, you know a lot of things and other people know a lot of things. Or when it comes to jobs, it can look like you truly believing that you are a lot less qualified for jobs than everybody else is. Everybody else is hyper qualified, and then there's you. Or it could be things that you just beat yourself up for that are just out of your control. Things that everybody has literally already forgotten about, or things nobody noticed in the first place. So this is you getting hyper focused on things that really are small or don't matter a great deal. That's what imposter syndrome does. So when you think about allyship, I want you to be thinking about how these kinds of things are opportunity areas for us. How do you mitigate these things from happening to you so that you might be the best ally? Here's something else that gets in our way a little bit around allyship. It is the discomfort and confusion that we have about why we're centering on race and leading with race so much in this country. So the question for you to ask yourself is, why do you think we're centering on race? I promise it's not a trick question. It is one of those questions I'm going to ask you to contemplate, though. The thing that needs to happen is that you have an answer. And for each one of you on this call, you might have a different answer, and that's okay. We don't have to match. but it is important that you ponder the question to understand the why, the centering on race. The answer again will vary by person, but sometimes the answer could just be really very personal to you. And I wanted to share an example of that. I'm not centering on race just because I happen to be a Black woman. I'm centering on race because some of the stories that are important for us to visit and revisit are just close to home for me. And I wanted to share a real story for you because I want to inspire you to think about stories that you might have in your own families. This is a very old picture. It's my great grandmother. I loved her so much. Her name was Mamie Jackson. She lived in Middletown, Ohio, which is, if you've ever watched the Andy Griffith Show and you saw Mayberry, that's Middletown. I spent every summer of my childhood with her. And what I loved about her most was her ability to be a storyteller. And the stories that she told me most often were stories that came right from her mother. Her mother was born into slavery. So I got a chance to hear the accountings, firsthand accountings of what it was like for her mother to grow up enslaved in this country. So I guess it's close to me because I didn't learn about slavery in a textbook. I didn't learn about it in history class. I actually learned about it from my great grandmother, who imparted stories to me that came right from her mom. So slavery never was 400 years ago for me. It wasn't distant. It wasn't abstract. It was as close as the knee that I sat next to of my great grandmother. So that's a powerful story. Another part of the power of the story is the second part. You'll see that little boy in the picture. That's Mark. That's one of the family members that my great grandmother took care of. They were domestic workers, my great grandmother and my grandmother, for the same family, 2 generations of the same family, and Mark belonged to that family. The most stunning part about this story is the family that my great grandmother and my grandmother worked for were the original slave owners. They went from slave owner to employer of my family. So I want you to think about the intricacies of that story. And you might have a story that's just as intricate, different, but intricate. And I'm encouraging you to visit those stories and to think about the relevancy of those stories, because those stories have everything to do with the kind of ally you can be. There's nothing like it to be able to get yourself a little bit closer to the history that we're actually trying to solve for today. And your story matters in that too. So you've got some homework here. Yeah, sorry, you got homework. I want you to think about this, and I want you to think about it using yourself first. I want you to start with you. I want you to think about how you're seeing compassion fatigue show up. How are you seeing imposter syndrome show up? What about the recency effect? And this discomfort discussing race, how's that showing up in you? And I want you to reflect on that, explore that, even discuss that if you can. Then I want you to go external. I want you to think about how you're seeing these phenomena show up at work, in your community, even in your family, anyone that you serve. How are you seeing these things play out? On a societal level, how are you seeing these things play out? And as you're exploring those, and now that you've got a name for what these are, I also want you to begin to think about, as an ally, what is our responsibility in helping to heal some of these things or mitigate some of these things? And is that one of the most important roles an ally can have, is to help people along with the strengths that we bring to move some of this in a way that we might do collective work more effectively. We're really witnessing a need for a great deal of allyship and collective work right now. I'm a storyteller, and so I always have a story. I can tell you that I lived through the civil rights movement. And one of the things that did not happen in a sustainable way is working as a collective. There were absolutely allies involved in the civil rights movement, but to sustain working together was one of our downfalls. What an opportunity do we have today to not only have allies, but to have what we now call accomplices, people that are willing to stay in for the long haul, to work in a collective to solve problems and issues around justice. That's what we are asking for today. So to understand that, we need to understand what an ally is. An ally really is a person who either combines or unites their resources, their privileges, their assets, their talents with another for mutual benefit. And I want you to hear the operative words: mutual benefit. To be an ally is not just to be in support of another group. It actually benefits you to do it too. So it's got reciprocity built right into it. That's what an ally is all about. Sometimes to be an ally means that you're using privileges that only you have to help a cause or an issue or a situation. Sometimes it means that there's just a talent or a gift or a treasure that you have that might benefit a cause or an issue or a situation. So whatever that resource or privilege is, you are leveraging that by combining it or uniting it with someone else. And then, of course, I have an opinion about allyship. I do think we need less nouns and more verbs. It's one thing to say, I'm an ally. It's another thing to talk about what allies do. And so we need actions. We need active allies that not only are saying that they're allies, but are doing allyship work. It calls for action. And sometimes that action has everything to do with really understanding what the issue is. Now, I wanted to share this image with you. You've probably seen a million of these. I actually don't care for this image, but there's a part of it that proves and talks about my point. The image is flawed. It's flawed for a lot of different reasons, one of which is it puts the burden on the people in the images. It doesn't honor the fact that some people are living with disabilities, so the image isn't reflective of them. So there are flaws in it. But what I want to draw your attention to is the third frame, this one down here that says liberation. When we are talking about allyship, we really are talking about what that frame actually says. We're talking about getting to the point about the issue. And the issue, if you follow these images, is really the fence. The fence is the barrier. The fence is the inequity. And so what this is suggesting is that if we just named our fence and concentrated on our fences and removed our fences, we would then have a world where people were more liberated in that world. People would be in a system where they'd thrive. You might not get the same things, but you'd get exactly what you needed to thrive in the system. That's what that third frame talks about. So I want you to think about this as an ally. What can you do to get involved in what that third frame really talks about? How do you get into the fence work? So the fence work really is this. It is you naming what you think the fences are. I want you to think about your own organization. Are there fences, barriers, things that are inequities in the system? And then I want you to look external to your system. Where in the world do you see other kinds of fences, barriers, inequities? Once you've named those fences, this is allyship work, then you contemplate, what would it take to get rid of the fences? What would that take once you've named it to get rid of it? As an ally, what then would you design instead? And what would the potential outcomes be if you did design something else, or if you did get rid of the fence that really is a barrier or an inequity? This is the active kind of work that allies would be doing always staying in a position of assessing. We call it interrogating your system, assessing where the opportunity areas are in a system. Really important. So the fence work is very important work. Now, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, but one thing that is always present in allyship work is fear. It's going to happen. It's a natural part of being an ally that there might be these periodic moments where your responsibilities in the work might frighten you. So I wanted to share with you just some thinking around fear, because we know it is one of the barriers. Fear comes in a couple of different categories, and I want you to know about them because I want you to explore them. The first kind of fear that crops up is something called the state of fear. And the state of fear is fear that you have because of something that happened to you before. You know, you parked your car in that neighborhood, they broke into your car, you're not going back over there with your car. Why? Because they broke into your car when you went there. That's just an example of a state of fear. You're afraid of something because you've had a real experience with it. And then there's the trait of fear. The trait of fear is real fear too, but it is not fear about something that's ever happened to you before. It is fear that you have that's based on a perceived danger that you feel. So one is something really happened to you before, and one is perceived danger. I feel like this might happen. Now, what does this have to do with allyship? I want you to know that they can stop you, these fear bases, dead in your tracks in being an ally. If something's happened to you before that scares you about this kind of work, it will stop you in your tracks. That's the state of fear. If you're always in a paranoia, imagining a fear about something in this work, it'll stop you in your tracks. They will both stop you in your tracks. So one of the things for you to be thinking about is, again, how do you disrupt and mitigate these fears that sometimes keep you from doing a beautiful job in your allyship work? And the one I want you to know about most, they're both important to explore. So I want you to pay attention to trait of fear. Because here's the deal with that one. It's real. We operate from that one the most. 85% of the time, we operate from the trait of fear. Fear that is not based on anything that's ever happened to us, but we are afraid anyway and stopped in our tracks and proceeding in our allyship anyway. So what an opportunity we have right there in fear mitigation to be thinking about what scares you about this work. And once you identify what scares you about this work, I want you to then think about how much of it is the trait of fear playing out, how much of it is the state of fear playing out. Really important. If it's the trait of fear, then we've got an opportunity to say, there is nothing for me to be afraid of here. If it's the state of fear, it's a deeper exploration. The other thing I want to share with you, as you're thinking about your allyship, I've asked you to think about everything from compassion fatigue to recency effect, to imposter syndrome, to these difficulties that we have even talking about things like race, to making allyship a verb versus holding it as a noun. And then thinking about fear and the impact that it has. We also have to think about power. Power is an important conversation to have. Now, we talk about privilege a lot, and I know that you've probably talked about that too, but we don't talk about power a lot, and I want to visit that with you. I love this model. It's dated. It's 1954 and powerful. It's called the 5 Bases of Social Power, and I love it because it helps us to think about power in a broader way. It's like that first image I showed you about thinking about the whole boat. This is an example of that too, is thinking about the whole boat of power. You know, we center on number 1 and number 5 a lot. We center on power being about your title, and power being about your ability to punish other people. We center on that a lot, particularly in the US. But the reality is, those aren't the only kinds of power that exist. We just don't talk about the other ones enough. So when I think about the number one thing you can do as an ally is to work in a collective, to teach people about power so they know they've got some. That's one of the best things we can do. If we can just equip people with that, we would say, job well done, allies. But let me walk through it really quickly with you. The first one is the one we know best in the US. It's legitimate power, it's called. And it's the power that you have that's based on your title, your position, or your rank. Doesn't say a thing about competency, but it is position power that it's talking about. And we have lots of systems in our country that are really based on that. I think about the US military, it's grounded in rank. That's where power is in the military. So you can think of all kinds of examples. Even in your organization, there is power in titles and positions there too. That's just the way we're built. The second one is expert power. Expert power is the power that you have that's based on your skills, your abilities, your knowledge, your talents. That one has nothing to do with your position. It's just skills and abilities power. I love this one because, but we understate it. The quick story, I was the head of HR for the city and county of Denver. There was a woman in our housekeeping staff. Her name was Graciela. Graciela spoke very little English, but every day, the entire time I worked for the city and county of Denver, she'd come to my office at 6 p.m. She'd hand me a little piece of paper. And on that little piece of paper was a leadership tip. And she wanted me to use that leadership tip each and every day. And I did. I call that expert power. And so I started using those words with her. And I said, Graciela, you've got so much expert power. And she'd look at me and she'd say, no. And she'd show me her broom and her mop to remind me that she had no power. That's why we have to talk about power. People don't know that what they're doing, what they have, what they espouse is power. Even our young people. When I was raising my kids, I always called what they did power, whether it was positive or negative, because I wanted them to know it was power. It could be leverage for good or it could be leverage for bad. I needed them to know that. So remember that as you're doing your allyship work. Referent power. Referent power is the power that you have that's based on reciprocity. It's the power of mutual respect. I respect you, you respect me back, therefore I have referent power. Reward power is the power to give and take away rewards. And then there's coercive power, the power that you have to punish other people. I just want you to know that we all use all of these power bases all of the time. But to be a great ally, you have to have a consciousness about these power bases. One, to be able to reflect on how you see them being used around you. Two, so that you might think about the ones that you personally are using most often. We typically use power in pairs. And I've got some news for you. The number one power base in the US, regardless of system or sector, is number one and number five, legitimate coercive power. It's how our systems were built. And so we've learned how to behave in that way. So your job as an ally is to figure out how we disrupt that so that we might work in a collective. Which power-based combinations of two work better when we're trying to be in a collective? And you're probably already thinking about it. Maybe number two and number three are better, ideally, for us to be working in. Or if you are operating in number one because your title is important in the system, what secondary power base might you use instead of number five? So be thinking about how the power bases play, and more importantly, how you're using them. It has everything to do with your effectiveness of an ally. So educate yourself. The worst thing you can do is ask other people to educate you on what you need to do. So staying astute about what people are facing, what systems need fence work, and where justice issues might be would be very important. And the listening part of this is important for all of us. So educate yourself and listen. Recognize your privileges. There's that word again. I want you to know how your privileges are playing out on a regular basis. And if you don't know where your privileges are playing out or what your privileges are, then it's hard for you to work on it. And then it's hard for you to be an ally. So this constant exploration of your privileges. What do you have as a gift, a talent, a treasure, a resource that not everybody else has? Is your exploration. And the more that you are committed to doing that, the better. This one's hard sometimes. At least it's hard for me. And that's the knowing when to step back. Remember that allies are there to support and to amplify the voices of people that are doing the work and that sometimes don't have a voice. And so again, this is sort of selfless work. This is you creating spaces for other people to use their voices. It's really less about your voice and more about amplifying the voices of others. And knowing when to step up. There are just simply times in this work where you can use your privileges to help create spaces for other people, spaces that are not already carved out, and to call out injustice where you see it. So you may find that as an ally, you're using your voice in ways that you've not used it before. And remember, in this allyship work, it kind of goes back to that first picture I showed you of the triangle. You thinking you did something great, your colleague or community saying, no, you didn't, and the person in the background that's supposed to be paying attention, not paying attention. Everyone is going to slip up. I'm going to tell you that right now. You might make a misstep, but even if you meant well, it doesn't mean that what you said or did wasn't hurtful. Someone may call you out about that. And so your job as an ally is to apologize about whatever happened, to commit to changing what you did, and to learn from what occurred. Just remember, it's not always about impact and intent. Sometimes those are the converse of one another. Sometimes you're going to need a strategy. I don't want to over-engineer what it means to be an ally, but you will learn techniques along the way that will be really helpful for you. I have an ally strategy, and I call it an upstander strategy. I'm normally not a bystander, I'm an upstander because I believe in verbs. But sometimes what I do falls in these 4 categories, and I wanted to share it with you because it might be something that you might find useful. Sometimes as an ally, depending on what's going on, I will either interrupt, question, educate, or echo. So sometimes as an ally, I might hear something that is so egregious and so offensive in a moment, like a few weeks ago when I was in a session and somebody called the COVID-19 virus a Chinese virus. They said that in the meeting, and I was the minority in the room, and I decided that the interrupt technique would be the one that I would use as an ally. There were Asian Americans in that call, and I wanted to be an ally. So my allyship in interrupting was, I said, hold on, can we go back to what you just called the virus? That's all I did. It disrupted the moment. It affirmed the presence of Asian Americans that were a part of that system and the offense that was happening to them in real time. And it froze the moment in a way that it made this person have to retract or talk about what he had just said. So sometimes interrupting is what you might do. Sometimes it's questioning. Something might come up and you find through your own privileges that you asking a question might change the course of what's going on. So in that case, you might say, what made you say that? And it continues a conversation that might not otherwise be a continued conversation. Sometimes it's educating that you might want to do. And you might want to add to what's going on by saying, here's what I know about the historical impact, or let me share my personal experiences. Sometimes there's space for that in allyship to educate as you add to what's already being said. And then sometimes you're simply going to echo. I find as an ally, depending on what I'm having my allyship around, I'm doing a lot of echoing. And that is, you're just coming behind somebody and affirming what they just did. So if someone just spoke up about something, then as an ally, what you might say is, thank you for saying something. And that's all you've got to say. So you're affirming what someone else is saying. So sometimes it's important to think about what your strategies will be. And they'll be variable depending on what's going on. These are just four that I typically use. A couple more things, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. I do want you to also remember in allyship who you are in the room. Now, this picture, every time I look at this picture, I'm just floored. It's me again. I was at a conference talking to this lady and an ass walked up. Seriously, it just walked up and it just stood there and its hat matched my dress. And I don't know if that happens to everybody, but it certainly happened to me. Anyway, somebody took a picture of it and I don't know what to do with it, but share it with you. Well, I guess one thing it teaches me is you have to decide who you are in the room. You can be that lady, or an ass. You get to pick. But the other part of what's on this slide is what's really the most important. It's 20-60-20. It's that rule. I do want you to know in allyship, 20% of the people are going to be gung-ho and understanding about why you are being an ally on a particular issue. But there's 60% of the people out there that are still trying to figure out how to be an ally, what that looks like, how you're supposed to do it, around what issue. So we've got 60% of the people that are tentative and still exploring. And then we've got 20% of the people that are never going to be an ally on these issues, especially today's issues. They're just not. So one of the things I just wanted to be clear with you on is that not everybody is going to be situated just like you. You might be a part of the 20% that get it, you know how to be an ally, and you're gone. Or you might be a part of the 60% that are still trying to figure it out, tentative but willing. And then there's the 20% that might even include people here that don't want to do it at all. I want you to know that's how it's stratified. That's important for you because as we do collective work, I want you to know that you might be working with 80% of people, not 100% of people, and how they fall in this ordering. It's really important for you to think about. And then I want to end with this because I think it has everything to do with allyship. It's probably the most pointed example that I have of it. So you're looking at another one of those old pictures because you know I've got a lot of them. This is me again. I'm 5 years old in this picture, and I wanted to be a ballerina. So I told my mom I wanted to be a ballerina, and I'm sure she rolled her eyes, but she took me to a ballet school anyway. When we got to the ballet school, the people at the counter said, "We don't accept Negroes here." Well, when we got back in the car, my mother didn't say a word. She just drove me to the next ballet school. And when we got to that one, the people at that school said the same thing. They said, "We don't accept Negroes here." Well, we then went to ballet school number 3, 4, 5, and 6. Each one of them said the same thing. "We don't accept Negroes here." Well, this time when we got back in the car, I looked at my mom and I said, "Well, why don't they want me?" And my mother said to me, as only your mother could, "Sweetheart, they don't know how excellent you are yet," which is such a beautiful sentiment from your mom, except when you're 5. It makes no sense. And my heart was broken. Well, the next day, I went to my all-black inner city Atlanta kindergarten class. Remember, I was living in segregation. And that lady that you see in the picture walked in. And that's Miss Ann. Well, we'd never seen a lady like her before. 1, we'd never seen a white person in our school before. And 2, we certainly had never seen one like her. She was a ballerina, and she was dressed like one. She was in leotards, tights, and a tutu. And she stood in front of us and she said, "Good morning, class. My name is Miss Ann, and I'm going to be your ballet teacher." And that's really the end of the story. But I want to tell you the moral of the story. The moral of the story is you're looking at a picture of when I think I first learned what allyship really is. 5 years old. And here's what I learned. I learned that allyship can show up in unsuspecting packages. So don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't be an ally around something. Miss Ann was living proof that it can show up in unsuspecting packages. The second thing that I learned right here in this picture is that allyship takes bravery and courage. She wasn't even supposed to be in that neighborhood, let alone bucking the system, which is exactly what she was doing. That takes bravery and courage. And lastly, right there in that picture, I learned that allyship does take love and caring. And if you don't have that in you, you're not going to do it. So I wanted to leave you with that story because I think it beautifully illustrates what allyship can be. Sometimes allyship is nothing more than you showing up, just like Miss Ann did in my life. And just because she showed up that day, my trajectory completely changed in the world, just because she showed up. So I want to leave you with that as an inspiration, is to always remember that there will be moments in the world where your presence makes all the difference in the world. And that is the power of allyship. Thank you for that. Thank you for continuing to be allies. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I want to be able to leave a little space here for any of you. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments, I'd be really happy to answer anything that you have around what I talked about or beyond.
Before we do that, I definitely, Dr. Mosby Tyler, want to thank you. That was really amazing, and I love even the verbs over the nouns. I thought that was very powerful amongst a lot of things that you mentioned. So thank you for that. But yeah, so do want to open it up to any questions that may be out there, and please feel free also to throw some in the chat if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask.